Hi, everyone. Can you let us know if you can hear us okay in the room? Somebody online?
We can hear you.
Hear you
Yes,
just
we
fine.
can hear you.
Great.
Well, welcome everybody. Happy Thanksgiving week. We tried to move the meeting, but we were unsuccessful in getting a room to do that for last week. So here we are today. With that, Celeste, I'll turn it over for roll call.
Okay. Okay, thank you all for attending Risk Modeling Advisory Work Group being held on November 21st, 2022 at 1 p.m. I will now open this meeting with some information for the work group. The Risk Modeling Advisory Work Group will be following the open meeting requirements of Bagley-Keene. If you would like to speak, please raise your hand. Members of the public can comment on an agenda following member discussion, but we ask that you limit your time. For items not on the agenda, the public will have an opportunity to address the group, but you are asked to limit your comments to 3 minutes. Restrooms, for those of us located in the hallway, restrooms are located behind me, down the hall there, past some stairs, and the code is on the back or on the front of the room here. Somebody did tell me today it's all odd numbers, starting with the number 3, so it's all the odd numbers pound in case you need that information. I will now take roll call. So Jim McDougall,
Here.
Carlos,
Good afternoon here.
you, Deborah,
Here.
Neil,
Present.
Paul, Max, Nancy,
I'm here.
Dave Winokur, Robert, Marshall.
Here.
Thank you. Anthony Powers. Yana.
Afternoon.
You here, just to make sure?
Yeah, here.
All right, thank you. Chris Ochoa. Dory. Terry. Joe
Here.
and Melissa.
Here.
And we have 9 people in attendance. A quorum is 8 people plus 1, so quorum is just established. We will now move on to agenda review, and a motion will be required. Chief McDougall will move forward with this task. Thank you, everyone.
All right, everybody's had a chance to review the agenda. Is there any additions or deletions to the agenda for today?
One thing I meant to mention is our January meeting is scheduled for Martin Luther King Day, so we might want to talk about rescheduling.
All right, thank you.
There's something in the charter regarding that, and I just don't remember what it is yet.
Okay, we'll look at that. Towards the end of roundtable, we'll pull that up and take a look at it. But yeah, there's something in there about the holidays, so it's following something, I believe, or prior. Anybody else have additions or comments to today's agenda? Okay, with that, is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second, so Nancy and Robert. All those in favor? Aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, motion carries unanimously to adopt the agenda. Then we'll move on to approval of the last minute's meeting. Meeting for the last minute. minutes for the last meeting, excuse me. Is there any discussion?
Move approval of the minutes from the past meeting. Got me all screwed up.
Me too, yes, we'll get it straightened out here. All right, so there's a motion by Robert to approve the minutes from the last meeting. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor of approving the past meeting minutes, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Very good. So we've been doing some thinking, and I think everybody received the email Celeste sent early this morning regarding the draft outline. Does anybody not have that? Okay. So I'd like to go over it. The first page is our goals and objectives, basically. And
That is a
then,
great idea. I don't think I've done that yet.
what's that? Is there a question? Sorry.
I think it was.
Oh, gotcha.
Jim, would you like me to put it on the screen?
Please do. I can see everybody. That's a good thing.
Loading, everyone.
Close now. Let's go to the second. Okay, so what we tried to do, a lot of help from Nancy on this project. Thank you very much. Just try to, again, frame up where we're really trying to go as a group and where we're required to go based off the goals and objectives. As you know, we're required to have a report to the legislature in July. And so working backwards from that, getting the document written, having time for the Wildfire Mitigation Task Force to review the document, make any additional edits, and then get it approved. We've kind of built this timeline. And what we've done is under each item of the table of content. So I want to, we want to work through this as a group. What we're proposing at this point are the 4 bullet points as those contents of the report, which is defining wildfire risk, the mitigations that matter, and then modeling wildfire risk, the types of models, and then barriers and recommendations for determining wildfire risk. Does everybody agree, or does anybody have any additions they want to add that for items that we would include in the report? And we can work on this more, but just generally, do you think that the topics we need to discuss to meet the goals and objectives are within those 4 bullet points? That a yes? That's still reading it?
Jim, this is Joe Irvin. I think that looks pretty good in my viewpoint. So there's some
Thank you.
feedback. Yeah.
Okay.
And just for everybody's, I guess, ease of use, I repeated the objectives on page 1 of the outline in italics. So I obviously we want to make sure that the final report does meet all the objectives. And so as we're going through, we have spaces where we think those will get covered. There's a lot of bleed over from one to the other, but we tried to organize the discussion so that each of the objectives would get met somewhere or other in one or more places.
Okay, we can keep coming back to that if you want, but kind of the thought processes here is you'll notice that we put a month behind like item number 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so the idea would be to discuss defining wildfire risk during this meeting. And the bullet points that are there are the ones we've taken from previous conversations in these meetings. And then we can add to that those topics that need to be discussed during defining the risk. And then at the next meeting, we will review that. We'll take everybody's comments back. We'll update this document, and we'll spend the first part of the meeting discussing item number 2 in December, and then discussing item number 3 in December as well, and get all those bullet points in there. And we'll continue to do that with each item, reviewing and then adding to the new all the way through February. And then we'll definitely be, we can start figuring out how we want to write some of those. If folks want to be involved in writing those with the group, or if there's a group that wants to work on some of them, or however we decide we want to do that. But this is just a tool to keep us moving forward and getting things accomplished to meet that deadline of getting this report turned in on time. Does that sound like a good plan? Anybody's comments or thoughts around that? Different ideas to get us where we need to be in July?
It seems like a decent structure. This is Yana to get us going. I'm sure there'll be some edits and additions as we dig into it and figure out some topics are maybe a little bulky for one meeting, but it sounds great.
Good, thank you. Yeah, exactly right. We can kind of this is just like a guiding document to keep moving. But yeah, no doubt. And we really kind of thought there may not be a tremendous amount of discussion around the barriers, because I think as we discuss all the other topics, I think we'll be identifying barriers as we go. And so we'll be sure to keep track of those and then add them to the barriers list that we can review when we get to February. But I think we'll identify numerous barriers as we work through those topics, especially when we start talking about mitigations that matter, because we all know there is a lot of barriers there. But I think that will help build out item number 5 as we work through the document.
There was one other thing that we talked about at last meeting, and I think it could happen concurrently in the next few months, is questions about specific catastrophe models and a desire for the group to get more informed about individual catastrophe models and maybe have presentations. Jim, is it okay if we chat about that briefly?
Yeah, let's talk about that. Yeah.
Okay. The one suggestion was, rather than to take up 20 or 30 minutes for a modeler's presentation and then Q&A during these 2-hour meetings where you have so many people together, that maybe another way of handling that would be, at this meeting, you guys could just say, I want to hear from CoreLogic. I want to hear from, I want a longer Dave Sapsis report. I want to know what they're doing in Colorado. And then we could try to schedule separate webinars with these individual CAP modelers or academics, if you want to hear from them. And they could be, coordinated by Celeste, and people could sign up to go to them if they are curious and want to get deep into individual models. So that was just one other thing that we could do as a group to make sure people are feel like they're getting all the information that they need to contribute.
Yana, yes.
Nancy, that's a great idea. Do you think we could start with like a high level presentation on what are CAT models, kind of why one might be different than another? I mean, I'm coming in totally blind to that process, so I don't even know what I would want to request since I don't know very much about how their systems work in general. So that might help me want to know where I'd want to dig in to be
Sure.
helpful in this space.
Were you here at the September meeting when Matt Chamberlain did a presentation on that?
Can't remember now.
Okay, because maybe
Maybe I missed that one. I don't know.
yeah, that was the topic, and definitely I can send you a copy of the PowerPoint if it's not already part of the lore, and you could, for anyone who missed Matt's presentation, or he had to go really fast because it was right at the end of the meeting. If we wanted to have like another crack at Matt, and his was not naming any names of any modelers. He was really just descriptive. And so if you want a very high level overview of models versus scores, versus hazard maps, that Matt would be a good presenter for that. If you want any one of the model vendors to start with an overview of CAT models, I'm sure they all have this kind of information too. It's just up to the group which was the most useful.
Yeah, and I think, it's been a couple months since we had Matt, and we've discussed a lot of things, and he did get, not the full time. We think he had 20 minutes, we pushed him into 15. We had a lot to talk about fire hazard severity zones too. So Mike, Nancy, if Matt's willing to come and give another presentation, I think if that's what the group would like, I think Yana thinks, what's everybody else think? Would they like to get a review of that and have that discussed again, since we've been having a couple meetings and wrapped your head around it? I see a thumbs up. So.
A quick web search did yield a CAT model definition.
Well, that's good.
Well, they're usually designed around catastrophe. I really do actually think that Matt presented some really great high-level information about model structures. Ordinal models that are classified versus actual sort of, expected loss models are fundamentally different. One informs risk in a relative sort of ranking kind of framework, and one gets to a value that could be rolled up into a business process. And these high level kinds of themes are really actually very important for folks to understand, because there's so many decisions that a model builder makes that they're sort of threading a series of needles of need and opportunity to end up with the product that they end up with. And oftentimes, the interested parties are reviewing the models themselves without a lot of context to understand why the model got built the way it did. And so I think that kind of high level discussion really benefits this group, because again, we want to all be clear in that the work plan that we produce at the end of this is designed around a knowledge of how risk models have been produced, because they've been around a long time and they take a lot of different forms, and that they do really fundamentally address all of those italicized objectives on the first page.
Well, I can speak for Matt, who works for me, that he will be delighted to do this. Would December, like sometime in first half of December, be where we should shoot for? Or do y'all want to wait till after the new year?
This is Celeste here, Nancy. That will be fine. I just need, because there will be more than 3 of us meeting at one time, I have to post an agenda regarding this, and it has to be posted for a minimum of 10 days. So we can do that. Jim's
Okay.
making a face. If you guys can't see it, he's making a thinking
Oh,
face.
it's this whole process.
So
challenge.
just as long as I have it, so if we want to do like the 10th or 12th of December, I just need to, have something up by the 1st or 2nd. So just if you could shoot me some dates and amount of time. It sounds like the 15, 20 minutes wasn't enough time to go through the presentation. So maybe we could do an hour and that would allow for some Q&A at the end as well. And we'll just do it via Teams if that platform, because that's the platform we're using for this group. If that's okay, with everyone, is that okay with you, Nancy?
It's absolutely okay with me, except I'm just going to give you Matt and let y'all work out dates yourselves.
Okay, that sounds great.
That'll be a lot more efficient. And I imagine you're going to want to, survey the group too, who's interested in attending and when they can come and all that. So yeah, I'm sure since he's already developed the PowerPoint, it'll be pretty easy for him to be flexible. So thank you. And is there a desire to go ahead and start lining up other modelers for the future? Because we could do that now if y'all want, or we could wait.
I think we ought to at least try to get the next one for January and be a little bit ahead of this process.
Okay.
For the group, is there some specific item you'd like to take from the next one?
This is Melissa from Energy Safety. Wondering whether it'd be valuable for you all. I feel like there's two different ways this presentation could go. One is just how we are thinking about like with the utilities, what we require of them in terms of a risk framework. I actually have some things I was going to show in terms of definitions today, but another option would actually be asking some of the utilities themselves to present their risk models for looking at wildfire consequence and how they look at mitigations and things like that. It's obviously a little bit different because it's not straight onto properties, but it does include a lot of the components that I think a model that we would want to recommend would include. So throwing that out there, if there's interest, we could probably get that together.
Utility.
Do you have somebody specifically in mind? Go ahead, Nancy.
I would really benefit from this because what the utilities, they're a huge part in the the process of, well, starting fires and then changing what they're doing to mitigate. And I'm not sure there's enough visibility between the insurance industry type modeling and what Melissa and her group are doing and the companies that they are overseeing. So I know it would be really interesting, and for this group, I've got to believe it would help us have a more informed view for our state when we're writing this report than if we only focus on what the insurance industry does, which is the part that Matt knows about and that I know about.
Well, so how about this? We are about to be finishing our guidelines, which is essentially what we require of the utilities to submit in terms of their wildfire mitigation plans. One component of that is risk. And I can even just put it up on the screen briefly today to just show you how we're thinking of it, or another time. I think having that kind of context in terms of how we're thinking about it would be useful. But I also do think, Nancy, from what you just said, it might be worth getting some of the utility representatives in, somebody from PG&E, somebody from San Diego, and they have presentations, they've done them for us in terms of how they model their risk.
Do they all use different risk modelers, or they're using a proprietary company?
Yeah, they make their own. They're all different, and that's one of the things. And we have our own risk modeling working group as well right now, because we're trying to develop best practices for use across all of the utilities. But they each have their own proprietary models that they use to determine their risk at the circuit level, and then also they're building the capabilities to determine which mitigations to run the models, to make recommendations on what mitigations to use at each circuit. And they're at different levels of maturity in this.
Yeah, let's, why don't you send us what you think would work? I mean, you think bringing in PG&E or Edison would be the way to go? Or do you think one of their specific modelers would be better? Thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's their staff people doing these models. So I could reach out to them and ask if they would be willing. I'm sure they would. Perhaps we can put, this would be a somewhat time consuming presentation. So definitely something separate from this meeting, but we could also then present from our risk modeling working group, kind of what some of the best practices that we're trying to develop, and perhaps even, present some of our guidelines. So we could maybe make it a joint presentation of a bit of our stuff, so that you have the context and overview, and then the utility specific models themselves.
I think that's a really good concept. You can show, yeah, what the guidelines are and then how they're fitting within that, right? So.
Mhm.
It's that.
Yeah, why don't you reach out and then get in touch with Celeste and I, and we'll work with you setting up a time, and we'll do that for February.
I will do that. Just as an FYI, I'm actually going to be out for 2 months, but I will make sure that you're connected up with whoever's going to be my proxy, and we'll get this started.
That's for February?
January.
January, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I got a month ahead.
Dave?
Well, yeah, I just was gonna add that I've been part of the review process of the fire mitigation plans and watched the evolution and development of the utility risk models, and they really are mid-maturity, and they provide some really outstanding examples, I think, for the group to understand key scoping and focus of a model relative to a particular kind of problem. And the challenges involved in developing a truly mature model that can understand mitigations to reduce those risks. So again, I think that's a major architectural component of the work plan that we're trying to drive home for the July report here. And so, maybe Melissa, I could work with you just on focusing the presentation to meet the needs of this working group. I think it'd be a really good presentation.
Yeah, that'd be great. I can't see who's talking though. Can you just tell me who's?
Oh, I'm Dave Saxon, sorry.
Oh, say Dave. Sorry. Yeah, it's just your screen. The box is so small I can't see your face. So okay, yeah, Dave, if you could just reach out to me, or I can reach out to you. I have your email, and we can figure it out.
Okay. That sounds great. Does anybody else have any ideas of things they want to see, or we can plan the one for February at the next meeting? No? Okay. Well, maybe we'll get some more ideas after the presentation in a couple of weeks, so get people's minds thinking towards models. Okay. Any more around those meetings? Or those webinars? We're gonna have to try to see how we can word this. It's not, I guess it technically is a meeting because there's more than 3. So that's a complicated part of everything we're doing, including back to the work plan. We can put together a group of people to work on things, but if we assign is it more than 3 or more than 2? More than 3 people, then we have to agendize that meeting. And so that gets really hard in a work group to work on a topic. 3 or 4 people, once you get to 4, then we have to agendize the meeting every time. So it gets really complicated. So as we work through this, we really have to keep our thoughts around how many people are actually maybe working on a topic, because we get past 3, we got to agendize it. Does that kind of make sense to everybody, the rules we have to follow? I know it makes it very complicated for me, because I'd like to have 4 or 5 people working on each one of these, but then we get into agendizing every conversation you folks want to have working on it. So it's difficult. Okay. Any questions about that piece? So let's just dive into defining wildfire risk. So we put some bullet points on there. We just have open conversation, and for us in the room, we'll make sure we introduce ourselves when we talk so everybody knows who's talking, and maybe if we can do that online, because it's a little bit difficult for us to see unless your little circle lights up who is speaking. So I'll open it up into open discussion around defining wildfire risk.
This is Melissa again from Energy Safety. Oh, Yana, you have your hand raised. I didn't raise my hand, so go ahead.
No, I was just going to ask if someone is taking notes or whether we're supposed to be doing that.
So we are taking notes and we're also recording the meeting.
Okay, and so in terms of the writing task, will there be staff assistance to try and at least capture the range of the conversation?
So we really don't have those. We have Celeste and myself and Richard. And we're taking the best notes we can. It's why we're going to need help doing the writing. We do not have staff to do that. But we will be capturing all the notes like we have been and plugging them into these topics for next meeting.
Okay, so then in this case, you're hoping to inspire no more than 3 of us to take on topic number 2 and then topic number 3 and be able to keep track of where this conversation went and start to flesh this out. Is that correct?
Yeah, and we can get the people identified to help flesh it all out, but we can take the notes this month and then finalize it next month, and then that group can start working on that even more.
And to be clear, we're not trying to draft as a group on the meetings, really to talk about the sections and the concepts that need to be covered when the drafting happens.
Thank you. That's right. Does that help you, Yana?
That does. Thank you.
Okay, so this is now I'll jump in again, still not raising my hand. Melissa
Okay.
Semser from Energy Safety. If it would be helpful, I'm happy to flash up on the screen some of the definitions that we're working with. They're still in between draft and final form, so they're not quite public yet. And I get this is a public meeting, but I'm happy to do that if we have things for hazard and risk and just all sorts of different components, if that would be helpful for this conversation.
Yeah, no, that's what we're talking about, right? So.
Okay, so then I'm gonna just I think I can take over sharing, right?
Okay.
So, all right, so I'm just gonna go, so we have an, let me get up to risk. So we have an appendix to our wildfire mitigation plan guidelines. And again, we're breaking down risk into a lot of different areas. And so I don't know if I think you all can see at this point our definition of risk that we have here. But of course, it's more complicated than that, in that we have a risk component, risk evaluation, a risk event. And then I'm just going to scroll through. We can go back to any particular areas, risk management. There's just a lot of different terms. We also, talk about, we have definitions for rural regions, highly rural regions, things like that. I'm going to scroll up. Sorry if I make you sick for a second, but I want to see, I think we have a definition for hazard. I have to do my alphabet in my head. I don't know if anybody else has to sing the alphabet to remember where things are. Yeah, so we do have a hazard definition as well. So I'm, can move through any of these and look into them in more detail. If that would be helpful. So just let me know. I can't see you all except for, so you just, if somebody's raising their hand, I can't see it. And again, these are going to be finalized, should be finalized around December 6th on our end. So I can also share these with the group once they're public, once they're finalized.
I see a Nancy has her hand up.
Yeah, I think the hazard definition that you're showing us is fairly generic, generalizable. I didn't get the risk one until my eyes started.
Yeah, well, let me just hear.
Not track. I think that one was much more context specific. Yeah. No. That
one's pretty.
Yeah, that's generic. That's generic too.
That's generic. I think it's more, I was more just like introducing that we have some of these terms that might, be defined differently, but might be important.
Yeah, but I think your definition is it's showing the relationship. It's the anticipated adverse effects from a hazard.
Yeah.
And that's the point. So I think these are great starting points and general enough for the purpose.
So why don't I can stop sharing and I can just drop these two definitions, hazard and risk, into the chat so we have documentation of them.
Be helpful.
Okay, and then the only other, gosh,
Risk evaluation, that one's pretty useful. Yeah, it was risk event that started looking very utility specific. That was what I was looking at.
yeah, and we may not be wanting to on our end look at what could cause the ignitions. It's more how we prevent once the ignition has started from creating damage.
Do you have risk factor or model or mitigation in there?
We have risk management. Let me look again. Sorry if I make you sick. I know this is like the hardest thing to watch. I think we do have a definition for mitigation.
Yeah.
So I can
that's
drop a
nice
bunch of these
general,
in.
Yeah, that's a nice general definition too. And
Yeah.
I think if we start with those, and the actuarial literature has risk factors, maybe that's more of a term of art, but the point being that like your geography matters when you talk about mitigation, but you can't really mitigate your geography. I mean, where you are is where you are.
Yeah. This locally relevant might be useful. I mean, there's a lot of definitions in here that could potentially be useful. So let me just drop some in.
Okay.
I think I mean, initiative, it's a little bit utility specific, but kind of general enough of just how you're resolving, right? Trying to prevent or these the consequence, reduce the consequence.
Another good idea, a good benefit of starting with Melissa's definitions is that it's all one government, right? It would be a little better and easier for policymakers to work with the same definitions unless we have a good reason to use different definitions.
Yeah. And I think we do have some rural, highly rural. I can look. So anyway, so let me drop some of these in. Again, take it the caveat that these are still a work in progress. I mean, you can see there's all, these are actually actively being worked on in my team. So these may change just a hair. Oh yeah, like highly rural region. I don't know if we because I know there's some things about density in there, so we might want to use some of these definitions as a starting place, which of course are coming from the already established definitions elsewhere. But so yeah, just the caveat that some of these might change just a hair, and I can give final definitions later. I think December 6th is our target right now. Okay, so I'll start dropping those in, and we can move the conversation elsewhere while I'm doing that.
Okay. All right, so we'll do the risk versus hazard. Anybody have input on types of risk considered or not considered?
I have one question, which is, should there be a consideration of how risk is going to change over time in the report?
We're definitely taking that into account. That's one of the things we're pushing on in our risk modeling. This is Melissa again, sorry, from Energy Safety, is including climate change modeling and predictions so that they can develop how the risk changes over time. To date, the models have not done that.
Yeah, and we're really in the same boat. The real key to that answer to that question is to develop a quantitative model that can account for new or forecasted inputs. You either revise your baseline model based on a new assessment of probabilities, or you do a forecasted model that uses those out year inputs, and you establish that, again, those are an estimate of the future based on this model that's again trends in such and such a way. I think it's important for us to recognize, do we want a model that is nominally designed to define risk over a narrow band of time period, And if so, what is the plan for refreshing that?
A good one. Risk over time. New bullet point.
In that section.
Yeah, I made the notes of it too.
Okay.
So very good with how we define neighborhood community. We know it needs to be defined. That's a lot out there, right? So there's different ways to define those, I think, as a group. Do we want to really focus on defining what those are, or do we want to more focus on different levels of density? Yana?
Nancy.
Or Nancy, I'm sorry.
Oh,
Room.
I wasn't on this bullet. I was on a different bullet, and I just realized that maybe one thing we should have in there is why wildfire risk. Somewhere we have to have why wildfire risk is so hard to, like, what are the components, like the ignition, you know, the knowledge that there's a fire, you know, the current conditions when the fire happens, what human activity is. I mean, these are all things that are part of what ends up affecting the ultimate risk, you know, what the fire response is. I think somewhere it might go in the modeling section, or it might go in the risk section. And I think it goes along with the time scale. It's not the same as the time scale question, but it's a similar type of consideration.
So why welfare risk is hard to model is what.
Or what, like, what are the pieces of wildfire risk that you have to think of? And maybe it goes into modeling, but like in terms of how we define mitigation.
Okay.
There's a lot of different places that mitigation can happen. And
Right.
so I thought perhaps if we broke the process of wildfire down into the whole ignition, you know, fire spread and response, that would give some context for later, more technical sections. I think it needs to go in there somewhere. I'm not sure where.
Well, I think having that up in the front of the document is probably important, because we definitely do need to discuss it further down, right? So we do need to kind of talk about it in the first. Trying to think of a good name of the bullet point though.
And what components of wildfire risk or something like that.
I would think a model schematic would really go a long ways to flesh that out sort of visually and graphically. You know, because you can have, like you say, mitigations designed fairly distributed along the chain of events that result in impacts. And it's important for us to at least be thinking, in as much as this model is referenced against mitigations, to have that really clear to the public. In other words, you know, you can treat fuels and address hazard at the front end before any ignition results. Utilities can do a number of fire prevention measures to reduce the likelihood of it, you know, an ignition source. All of those are really driving at hazard mitigation. At the other end of the spectrum, you can enhance the resilience of things that are impacted by fire and reduce their risk. And the focus of mitigations across that spectrum is a good topic for the group to be thinking about.
So Melissa Semser here again. I'm sorry being rude here taking over, but I just wanted, as you were talking about that, I thought I'd just flash up one of the schematics we have that we're developing right now. I think this is a little bit of what you're talking about. Ignore the PSPS since that's a public safety power shutoff, but more the ignition.
Well, if being rude is putting up helpful information that lets us do our jobs, then I guess I can handle the rudeness.
I do, I think there's a lot that we can show you all. I mean, I don't know if you could see.
You're not sharing.
You're not sharing just yet.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I was. Let me try again.
Everyone, I have a question while you're doing that, Melissa, really quick, if I may.
Mhm.
So this is Joe Irvin. I hear the climate mitigation measure and the risk over time and how that impact is going to change. Is there any mention or thought on hardening of utility systems and that side of the risk management? Has anyone given that thought, or is that something that we're missing if we don't address?
I'm pretty sure that's why I'm on this group.
Yeah.
Melissa, again.
Yeah, we do, you're right, yeah, that's why, you know, hardening to that infrastructure in the community is super important, right? So, yeah, it does definitely play a role in what we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's really a great example because utility risk is all focused on their source of ignitions, which is their equipment and their locations. And so that falls into this entire sort of unique kind of risk modeling that is called risk associated with ignition location. A lot of our work is much more generic, which means like we're thinking on where does risk damage occur. So it can be really pretty confusing depending on if you're looking sort of, you know, from the east side of the tunnel or the west side of the tunnel. And I think that's why I was really highly in support of Melissa's suggestion of examples within their domain, because it really does allow us to contextualize how complicated risk is, how you know, regulations and policy and just general you know, good neighbor behavior drive a particular kind of perspective, and how we as sort of kind of the arbiters of this approach to global risk modeling can take that all in and develop a risk framework that really suits a pretty broad suite of needs.
I put that down on the power infrastructure. I put it under the mitigation side, under bullet number 3, just so we make sure we don't lose that, because that's a good point. That.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
So I can stop sharing, but just before I do, you know, just this is what I would want to present when we do present in January, so that you all can see some of just how the layers, you know, like, I mean, there's this schematic, obviously, but you can see the, you know, we have our whole section here over here, section 6, and just the top, like how we're all breaking this all down, because it may be useful, I think, over on this side. And then going from that to feed into the mitigations and the risk evaluation and all of that. So, anyway, there's a lot in here I think that can be helpful to this effort.
Yeah. Okay. What is the group? Unless you got, does anybody have any more on how we define risk that they want to add on that bullet point?
Tiana, I'm really curious, like coming back to what's not considered in this report, and I'm curious, you know, what is on people's minds in that space. Are these things that can't influence? Are they, I mean, coming back to the fire triangle, I mean, there's, you know, vegetation, topography, weather, and so we can't really affect the weather or the topography except for where we put people. Are we mostly talking about ignitions and fuels?
Quite possibly, Nancy, too. I think so. You know, there is a big conversation of, you know, factors out there that you can't control. Now, granted, topography might be one, but we'll probably have that in here. But at the same time, yeah, that's kind of the thing. You know, what things are we can not consider, because honestly, how do you can't evaluate, right?
Or you can't mitigate it, you can't change it.
Well, I think that's the point, is that a risk factor could be something that is very important in determining whether you're high risk or low risk, but it's not something that could be mitigated. And so when we're talking about mitigations that matter, we're going to be focusing on things that can be acted upon. So by someone. So I think that this just helps narrow the whole purpose of this report was to focus on mitigation, not only to understand everything that you'd ever have to understand about wildfire risk. It was to think about modeling for the purposes of mitigation. And so that's why we're trying to start from the outside and work your way down. Okay, so we're not going to be putting slope in as a mitigation, even though, or density. I mean, maybe density is something that can be mitigated, but probably not. We're going to be making decisions about treating something as immutable versus, actionable. Does that help?
I think it's good just to talk it out, like, and make sure we're on the same page. I mean, maybe the other backwards way to look at it is sort of what tools are in the toolbox, and that gives us a sense of what can be evaluated.
Right.
Right. I mean, like you're not going to move the location of a city, but
Right.
but you could do something to that community in some way that changes its potential outcome.
Right. You could maybe talk about putting in some green infrastructure as a mitigation, or clearing land outside of the city or something, but you probably wouldn't put rebuild at a different density as a mitigation. So there are going to be some gray areas. It's definitely not black and white, but it's I think a useful distinction to make so that people are not hopelessly lost when they're trying to figure out what's being said.
Yep.
Well, a follow-up to Yana, and I think a good example of this is a main driver in fire behavior is fire weather, frequency of severe fire weather. It's not mitigatable, but it varies in space. And so, the aerial influence comparing one area to another needs to account for those fire weather frequency differences. It's part of developing a reasonable and accurate assessment of hazard, which should be part of the model, but it isn't mitigatable. So it's, I think, incumbent on us with this mitigation focus to be clear about what elements of this equation that starts with ignition and ends with impact are important but not mitigatable, and those that we think we really have some degree of control over and can influence consequence.
Okay. So a quick question, Robert Marshall. In the last part of the discussion, I think you brought up something, Nancy, that probably needs to be better looked at, which is density. So density as defined in like the actual fuels that surround structures or a parcel or a community versus the density of the structures in that community or on that parcel. I think there's a few different ways to look at density, and I think it needs to be, I think some time needs to be spent on what that really means.
Agreed. Maybe we've got a little bullet there that doesn't say much. So you're saying from the buildings and the surrounding. What's the term of art? I didn't take the note fast enough.
So the things that I was thinking when I first saw density, I was thinking fuel density. And then you said something that made me think, oh no, it's not fuel density, it's density of structures. So what is the density of the structures on a given parcel versus the density of structures within a community-wide thing? And how does that actually interface with the density of the fuel?
Right.
Or is that taken into consideration? My sense is
fuel-
that's probably taken into consideration with the actual model itself, but
They're mirror images too, right?
what's that?
In some way, they're a mirror image, Mark Rosenberg, Cal Fire. In that, what is it that is occupying the other space? And
Right.
if you're thinking structure density or fuel density, but they might be, two halves of the same coin.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think it's necessarily always that way, because I think you can have a building that has dense occupancy that takes up a small footprint in a dense fuel area. A hotel.
That population density.
Right.
Yeah, it's.
So yeah, I think the point is, there are lots of different kinds of densities, and I think they need to be categorized in some way.
I agree. That's a great point. Thank you.
And there was an interesting discussion at the wildfire, I was at a meeting earlier this week, last week.
Mitigation advisory?
The mitigation advisory group, yes, about density. So I think there's a common thread there.
And that, we definitely work on that. Anybody else have any additions to, bullet number 2? Okay, how about bullet number 3? Good with that? Do we want to put some sub bullets under it?
So Robert Marshall again, in the fire and building codes, we sometimes talk about what we call important structures versus non-important structures. So for instance, a building that somebody is living in might be an important structure, whereas if it's just storing a piece of tractor equipment, for example, it's an unimportant structure. I'm sure it's important to somebody, it's just not important to us when it comes to, if we lose that structure, that's not as big of a problem as if we lose the structure that the person is living in. Or if it's something like a hospital where there are people who can't be relocated in a quick and efficient manner. So maybe there needs to be something in there under structure about important structures versus unimportant structures. And frankly, the other part of that is how do the unimportant structures relate to catching fire on the important structures?
So structure type, right, or, use type even.
Right.
Plays a piece in that, right, whether it's, like I said, a hospital, or it's a community infrastructure versus a residence, right, or it's a commercial building that, versus structures in there, and it's a
Right, and single family versus multifamily as well. So, yeah.
I think that's a good point to make under the third bullet, consideration of structure versus parcel versus community risk. What you're getting at is a piece of the discussion about interdependence and how when we're measuring risk, we have to think about the dependencies and when we're talking about mitigation, we have to think about that as well.
When I thought about that, it was an issue of scale and who has influence or control over the actions that may be needed. Scaling from the individual resident to potentially the homeowner to the community.
And I think that the sort of the community, as Dave Whitaker described it, really brought this home, why it's so necessary. We cannot have a model that only looks independently at structures, because the influence of structure loss is often determined by larger scale features of the neighborhood, not the least of which is ignition resilience of your neighbor that's, 10 or 20 feet next to you. And so one of the challenges in this decision space is structures themselves being the real focus of value, the desire to mitigate loss against, are also fuel components that impact spread rate and then associated loss of other structural components that are also fuels. So I think density here is best defined as its influence on both hazard, through its capacity to ignite and contribute to spread, and also as a sort of land use and value to individuals and the community, such that housing units or dwelling units are a good measure of sort of that personal, how houses function as, our shelter. And then other kinds of structures, more commercial nature, that have really important value to the community at large, like a hospital.
I think on Yana's point, it gave me two ideas. One is back in the back, under barriers and recommendations, the last section under need to coordinate among public-private landowners. That is an issue of influence and control, as she's pointed out. And I think that's a really important barrier that has to be, talked about separately in recommendations. It also is the case that risk is owned by somebody. And so there's when you're defining risk, like risk to PG&E, it's not risk that they burn themselves down. It's a risk that they have to pay for something that they did, a liability risk. So I think it would be good maybe in this paper to say, for simplicity's sake, we're really focusing on the risk of property damage primarily is what we're measuring. Although there are other risks like health risks and, the risk of community loss and liability risk that are downstream risks associated with large numbers of properties being burned down. But that's just my straw man. If the group thinks that we need to get past the original something burns down that's not a tree, to the next thing that happens after that, then that's up to the group.
Yana?
Thanks, Nancy. So you got me thinking a little bit more here. So what about, is this off our list, which is the risk of loss of life? So are we focusing really on property and structures and not on potential life loss? Because thinking about the arrangement of the community and whether or not there is an evacuation system that's going to be effective, or there's a shelter in place potential location, or those other elements could be another consideration in this risk framework. I'm not advocating for it, but it feels like it's kind of sitting out there and we should probably agree to either include it or not include it.
Mitigations would be different, risk factors would be different. I mean, they're related, but they're not the same. And sometimes they're actually in tension with each other.
Yeah, we had this discussion, I believe, in our second meeting, where I was really trying to focus scope of the risk. Risk to what? You open up a big can of worms once you get into public safety and evacuations. We're actually currently exploring an evacuation potential model for inclusion in our assessment. It broadens things quite a bit. I'll tell you that evacuation models are pretty complex because they have to have very, very good information with regard to characterizing the likelihood of a particular kind of fire coming from a particular direction, and a very robust model that understands how people get out. in general, my perspective is if we do risk to property at both parcel and community scale, we capture a lot of the vulnerability of areas for threats to human life. And that is at least a good first step. I think we want to think long and hard about whether we take on internalizing loss of life as a direct scope element of risk in this model. I guess I would argue that, and there is a section here in the outline clearly defining what we've adequately covered in our game plan here and what we see as iterative improvements to expand that scope.
If I could add
Yeah.
to that, I think if we do the structure stuff correctly, it actually takes that into consideration because you're gonna treat a multifamily residence different than you're gonna treat a single family residence. And the reason that you're treating it differently is because there's a high potential for loss of life there. Same thing with a hospital or a prison or a jail. You're going to take that into consideration. I think that also when you are looking at the community stuff, I think you also take it into consideration because I don't think we're going to give the same rating to somebody that has one way in and out on a 4-mile road than you are to somebody who has 5 ways that they could possibly go. So I think it actually adequately addresses that. And then anything that needs to be more granular than that is something that should be taken on by the individual community based on their tolerance for risk.
Yeah, I'm a little bit that way. I think as we define this from parcel, and when you get in community, communities have a different risk because of how many people there are, right? And is that community just single family residents? Is that community paradise with the whole entire town in the middle of it? Those get a little bit different at the community scale, right? So I think we're defining that neighborhood community. There needs to be a difference where we swap over and call it some type of community or however that looks, because they are definitely different, I think.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize my suggestion to not implicitly included in the model is because I don't think we want to get into understanding mitigation of evacuations. I think we have all the data to inform exposure. In other words, we've got information on how many people are in this community. And we have actually had demographic information about their vulnerability that we could characterize. My issue is, do we have a model that's sufficiently robust to say it needs a new 2-lane road going in this direction to mitigate loss of life due to low levels of evacuation potential? And again, I'll go back to whoever suggested that that's likely, at least at this stage, informed by this high level of exposure and sort of a city level of analysis. But again, we are thinking along these lines in terms of model development.
Mark Rosenberg, CAL FIRE. I will just throw in for sake of discussion, we do have a land use planning program that reviews safety element, that's a major mitigating, action that the department's engaged in.
And we're actually working together on that. The problem is it's SRM. Nothing in our approach here is really specific to protection responsibility.
I do like the suggestion that Robert put out there. If we've got some analysis related to ingress and egress, we've got part of the problem looked at.
Could have made us another piece.
You might not catch the paradises where you've got, basically one road out, and that's, maybe it's, I understand your concern with scope.
And it's really quite possible by March or April, we will have an assessment of communities statewide for broad scale evacuation potential from wildfire. Basically an ordinal model of risk associated with evacuation.
Doreen?
I
was just going to say and concur, I mean, we're doing it right now through transportation wildfire modeling for evacuation and potential impacts to infrastructure. So some communities are already doing that. And so, but it's very detailed and specific to the type and start, and it's quite cumbersome. So it's not something easy. So.
Okay. Well, and I think that's a good place to keep this in focus when we get down to number 3, because, you know, it's one of those risk factors. I know it showed up numerous times on the stuff we were doing last meeting, evacuation. So I think it's a good point to continue to flesh out as we move forward to that. Any other discussion around that? Okay. We did see one definition of mitigation. Is there some more discussion around that? Basically, I think we've all discussed it's something we can do to change it. You know, can you harden a home? Can you do fuels reduction? But what about that bullet item?
We put a fiscal lens on that?
Sorry, again?
Do we put a fiscal lens on that, or just put everything in the pool?
For defining what mitigation means?
Well, it says define something that can be changed to reduce risk. So a lot of things can be changed, but they might be beyond our financial affordability ever to mitigate. Does that need to be factored in now, or do we think about that later?
I think this section was to define, and that was just an off the top of my head thing. Chatting with Jim, the definition in the chat that Melissa put in is much more comprehensive. Essentially, it's an activity. It's not just the existing situation. It's an activity that can be taken, and so from a utility, let's see, I'm not going to use the word utility in a different context. From the usefulness of this discussion about modeling, we are going to try to focus on things that can be changed. And to your point, Yana, if fiscal concerns are a barrier, that is definitely something that should show up in the discussion about barriers. First, you think about what's high impact, and then you think about how what it costs, and how likely it is you could get someone to pay for it, and then decisions can be made. So both are very important. I agree.
See, I knew we would add something to barriers. I just put that bullet point in.
Great.
But the bullet point's not titled.
And so somewhere in here, we'll probably have like a bullet that's like types of risk that we are not focused on, that are also risk, but we're not focused on for purposes of this, for this report.
Yep.
Great.
Okay. Anybody have questions or comments about risk factors versus mitigation? Or things they want to add?
This is Dory. I just wanted to go back. Did we put in anywhere? I thought I heard 2 comments about risk as they change over time. Was that going to be in any of that, or?
I added that bullet point, earlier.
Oh, I just didn't see it on here. Sorry.
Oh, it's not, I'm taking notes.
Okay. All right.
Thank
I thought
you.
we were real time. I thought we were real time doing it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, what about focus on modeling risk for purposes of mitigation? I think we pretty much all agree on that. Is there any key items that would like to be added under that or some bullet point? Discussion? Okay. Anybody have any factors they'd like to add to the whole piece? We've talked about quite a few. And components of wildfire risk. Discussion about why wildfire risk is hard to model or the pieces and maybe some, the components that's kind of related. Then on the, how we define risk, I also have, the components and the valuation could be added into that piece of it. Under density, I have different types of density and, important structures or not important structures, types of structures, as we flesh that out. And also then it could be tied to the vegetation piece of it. Then we have a bunch of discussion around the consideration of the structure versus parcel community. As a risk of property life, how do we include the life piece of it? I think I just have these bullet points to add down for the next meeting. Is it part of the, really, does we get into the life piece of it when we get to the community level evaluation? And I added the bullet point risk change over time. And that short, long term. Well, I guess that's one too, that just kind of keeping it short-term risk versus long-term risk, right? I think we had that in some of my other notes. Some of the first meetings we had, we discussed, is a long-term risk or short-term risk.
Yeah, the classic example of that relates to FHSC being a long-term hazard model because one of the real drivers of it was building codes that last the time of the lifespan of a structure being built. And so again, there's another complexity agent that makes this entire kind of arena, sometimes confusing. But it is really important to understand that there are short-term kinds of risks and longer-term kinds of risks, and how do we want to understand those relative to policies or mitigations?
You got to do your defensible space every year.
Or the fire's going to come when you don't.
You only need to harden your home once. And that is, there's short term and then there's long and short term mitigations too, right? Nancy, I mean, when you talk about long term risk and short term risk, you have long term mitigations and short term mitigations. So maybe on that piece under mitigation, we talk about, think what mitigations might be long term and which ones might be short term, just kind of some discussion around that.
That sounds like a great idea. That's what I like about having an outline. It's like we can keep up with all these ideas and sort of weave them together as we go.
Anybody else have anything you'd like to add to this section?
Yana?
Thinking about coming back in December and what we're going to do, I wonder if the next step is to really flesh out this outline and start to fill in all the bullets. And then maybe we don't have to commit to writing it, but taking our conversation today and really fluffing out what's been established here would help us start to then frame each of the next pieces and see how we might, the level of detail, the level of conversation that we need to help inform this. And then we could really think more clearly about the audience and whether this is, I was looking back at our purpose, but if we want to make this approachable to people outside of the general vocabulary that this group has, then how do we really move to that scale in how we write this?
Yeah, I think, to your point, I think next month we'll put the stuff we discussed in here, and then we'll spend the first 45 minutes to an hour, once we get the meeting going, discussing that and fleshing out item number 2 a little more, and then start throwing some stuff in number 3, and then turn around and do the same thing again with number 3, is flesh it out a little deeper. At least that's how I see this workflow going. I think that's what you're kind of recommending, if I'm catching it right.
We could do a break for 5 minutes. I could put that stuff in.
What's that?
We could break for 5 minutes. I could put in what we've discussed and see if we're still missing anything. Does that sound, we could break for maybe 5 minutes and we could type in what we've discussed and then we can circle back and see if we are missing anything or if something didn't quite get in there? Does that sound okay?
Yes.
Okay,
I think they're like, okay. So I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna mute us and turn our camera off so you guys, we can all take a little break and we'll get some of this typed in. Everyone, we are back. We have made some changes. And we can go through them again as a group. Chief will do that. I just have them up on the screen. Anything that that everyone contributed today will be added here in red. If you can see that, and you will see that the notes happened over here on the side. We did add 1.2 barriers down here at the bottom as we move through it. We did add in the financial concern for mitigations here.
Does it look like we got everything for folks? At least did we represent it appropriately?
It looks good to me. I mean, I think I didn't see anything from my notes that y'all didn't get in there.
Yeah, it looks good to me. This is Melissa.
Okay.
The only thing I heard was maybe a model, a graphic visual to try and interpret some of this as an aspiration.
We want to add that under this point,
Model diagram.
under defining wildfire risk.
In the components category, that's where Melissa put up that model, which I think it could be adapted for this. There's probably under, yeah, you've got components in a couple of different places. And I think we could just say, like, show a schematic or something like that. I think the word model is it's going to get us off into another direction there. So just maybe include schematic and start with Melissa's.
I did have one thing I want at least to throw out to the group. When we talk about the density, the importance of density, has a group seen, and we can send out, if not, the NIST technical note 2205, which has built around home hardening. But there's some really good definitions in there about parcel level density, and how they classified it. Might be good for the group to look at. Again, that's referring back to a published document, that's some consistency. I know last time Dave kind of threw out that, he sees density if their houses are greater than 100 feet apart, or they're greater than 100 or less than 100, as an example of how he perceives it. What I think, kind of back to some of the points we discussed earlier, tying this to things that are scientific based too, right? Or published stuff that have appropriate definition. But if folks haven't seen that, we can send it out, but it might be something for you to look at between now and the next meeting, about how they define density, because it is specifically related to, home hardening at the parcel community level. Those things are related, so that this document kind of leads you down that path if you haven't had a chance to read it. Has anybody had a chance to read it? I figured you almost. What do you think? You think it's a good kind of starting point? It's a good basis, at least for folks to look at?
Yeah, I'm thinking about circles right now, as opposed to a linear feed model. With sort of different factors that kind of come into play on this trajectory of risk and the adaptations that can change outcome. But I'll noodle on that for a little while and see if I can come up with a visual to reflect what we're talking about. I mean, we're trying to show that there's multiple feeds and there's multiple pathways.
Yeah.
that affect our outcome. And I think that will really help frame this document and our audience's understanding of it.
Yeah, I like the circle thing before. It's a good concept too, you know? Yeah, I guess something for the group to think about as we work our way towards that December meeting. And we get into some of that conversation too, right? And it kind of does fit a little bit in this topic. So between now and the next meeting, that is a good review, maybe, for people to kind of look at.
There's also the fire adapted communities visual that could be borrowed from. There's some good things in that one.
Those all sound great. One thing I would just suggest is that components of wildfire risk get moved back under the how we define risk. Because there it is. I would just stick those 3 little bullets underneath that, and then we're good to go.
Oh, they got moved down, didn't they?
Yeah, so it doesn't matter. I mean, it's all in there now. I think how we define risk is the overarching thing: risk versus hazard, components, and then mitigation. But it's not a big deal.
Is that what you're saying, Nancy?
Not exactly, but it's okay. We can mess with it.
Clean it up.
Okay.
And in addition to those references, there's a couple of fairly good papers out of CSIRO in Australia that evaluated specific mitigations and their effectiveness relative to costs. Bringing back Jana's note about a fiscal lens, and I'll drum those up into the package that we give to the group.
Sounds like there's going to be some good ideas for section 4, research and models. So I guess as we're putting these ideas out there, maybe we could be tracking them in that section.
Yeah, so we'll get it down. We can then.
Yeah, maybe
Go.
before our January meeting, when that's going to be the main topic, maybe we can all like come with our research ideas.
And if folks have the research documents or something you want to get out to the group, like the one we sent out last week, I think it was, from Nancy, just get them to Celeste or I, and we'll continue to put those together and get out to the group as people think of them. There's so much of it out there. So we have about 20 minutes. So we need to discuss which, was it, the December meeting is on.
The 20th. Fun with it again. Oh, actually, December 19th.
Monday is the 19th.
And that's all in.
No, it's not a holiday.
No, the January.
Martin Luther King is a holiday.
So, usually we have this meeting, this month, and December got a little, well, December would have been okay. But December, the WMAC canceled their meeting, but they don't have a paper due like we have the homework assignment. So I really don't want to not have a meeting. But we're considering, there's just a couple of us here today. We may just do the whole meeting virtually in December, if that works for folks. And I think, to your point, it's been kind of confusing sometimes, but I think with this outline now, I think it's been a lot easier conversation to follow on our end. How about for you folks that are online? Is this an easier format? And useful? Okay.
Yes.
Right.
I do think there may be value in assigning some of this out to the groups of 3, to potentially do some work between now and December.
Online, it's really hard to see you guys that are in person, and it's, unless you recognize the voice, it's really hard to tell who's speaking. So I don't know if the owl could get moved a little closer to the horseshoe. Just throw that out there, because right now it's split between Celeste being, you can see Celeste and then you can kind of see three of you.
Did you have a problem with it last month when it was set up?
I was in person last month.
That's right. Okay, I only did set up one out because the room is significantly smaller than the room we've been working in. So I will make sure that we will definitely set up two moving forward.
And I also think you bring up a good point. We all forget it sitting here. But I think even online, you know, announce your name when you start speaking, because it is kind of hard for us to see too. So I think maybe just some meeting etiquette that, we move forward and when we go to speak, just, announce your name and then your comment. Maybe you'll help folks to a little more meeting clarity. So for the, I'm trying to look at my, thought I had it in here. So when the charter, the meeting falls on a holiday.
Do you have it?
The meeting lands on a holiday, the committee shall postpone and meet on the subsequent Monday. So, with it being January
16th.
we're supposed to be on the what?
I believe the 16th is the third Monday.
So we're meeting the 16th, so it'd be the 23rd.
The 23rd. Okay. Okay, so we'll send that out to folks. Thanks for bringing that up. We'll get that moved. We'll try to hunt up a room and get that moved to the 23rd for January. All right. So that's the end of the new business. Is there any roundtable discussion?
Did we conclude if we were gonna meet on the 19th?
Yeah, we'll do it virtually.
Virtually only.
Virtually on the 19th for December. And then, January 23rd.
This is Celeste, one other thing, if you're not gonna be at the 19th meeting, if you could let me know, because again, we have to have 8 + 1, 9 total to make a quorum. And so today we barely skated in here, so I know the holidays are difficult for everyone, so if you could just let me know sooner rather than later, that way we are not wasting anybody's time. So, that's great, thank you.
Good point. Anybody else with comments good for the order or things we need to do differently or whatever's good? Yeah, I don't see any hands go up. Everybody in the room's looking excited. Is there any public comment today?
There was one person, and I don't know if they disappeared.
There's something in chat.
Yeah, there was one, it was Chief something. Look really quick here.
Chief New.
Amy, Chief Amy?
Yes, hello.
So this is the public comment section. We have some public comment. Do you have any comment?
No, thank you.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you very much. Okay, we've gone over the updating of the new meetings for next month and or how we're gonna do the meeting in December and the new time of January 23rd. With that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Then, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Hi.
Hey.
Any opposed? I thank you all for the time today. I know it was difficult the weekend. Have an outstanding Thanksgiving. And we will get some stuff out to you folks and we will talk to you in December.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanksgiving.